I'm up here to talk a little bit about how we're using the cloud sort of now and where we see it going in the future. But before that, I'm actually going to go back even further because I want to give you some personal context about myself, because I think it's important to frame sort of the motivation for everything that we're doing and how we've gotten to where we've gotten. So I have this fairly embarrassing picture, and by the way, for those of you who don't know, I actually had this slide to tell you. I'm a visual effects supervisor. I'm also the CEO of Atomic Fiction, the visual effects company, and also Conductor Technologies, which is a cloud rendering software company. So back to the embarrassing picture. This is the embarrassing picture of my friend Ryan and I when we were about 7 years old in Seattle growing up. And we had a passion for movies like these. And it wasn't really until we saw this film that we had a real grasp of like what the common theme was between all those movies that we loved, and that was visual effects and special effects. Like Jurassic Park was a real aha moment for us in saying, oh my God, this is what we love about these movies. We want to do this for a living. We have no choice in the matter. This is our path, right? So we borrowed computers at schools that had like eval licenses of 3D Studio Release 3 for DOS, and we started making videos for high school assemblies, and then that got us jobs with Microsoft. And then that job with Microsoft got us filmed for a documentary that was funded by the George Lucas Educational Foundation and narrated by this wonderful man, Robin Williams. And through that documentary and the editing room, and there's a whole bunch of steps in the story that I'll gloss over here, but we ended up working here, which is the main house at Skywalker Ranch with this guy, George Lucas, on Star Wars Episode 1. So that was like 18 years old, right out of high school, pinching ourselves every single day. And it was really all came from this sort of aha moment after having sort of realized what our love for movies was around, that this is kind of what we wanted to do with our lives. We wanted to make these images, and we wanted to help people make these images in a way that was sort of as prolific as what some of these filmmakers had done for us as children, right? So fast forward a few years, we'd done our work at Lucasfilm. We worked at a company called The Orphanage. We were the first 2 employees there. That grew to around 200 people, and didn't invest a lot in technology, so we saw some of the pitfalls of not investing in technology, but the sort of the people at that company were really what made it what it was. It was a wonderful place to work, and it showed in the images that that company produced. Then we worked at a company called Image Movers Digital. And by the way, my friend Ryan, who that embarrassing picture in the driveway was with, we were together working throughout all these, right? So we experienced all this together side by side. And this Disney company, Image Movers Digital, was sort of the opposite. It was the opposite of The Orphanage, where it was huge. We had all the resources in the world, and we ended up having a bunch of infrastructure that was sitting around just burning money for a lot of the time, right? So it was like kind of depressing to see that, and it caused like some weird cultural things and behaviors to happen that we kind of weren't okay with, right? But we still were able to make great imagery, right? So there was good things about both. And so when our time at Image Movers Digital was over, we decided, well, we could go work for somebody else and learn some more lessons, or take the lessons that we've learned and start our own visual effects company. So we were crazy enough to choose the latter, and this is like in the years where Rhythm and Hughes was going under, and Digital Domain was bankrupt for like the second time or whatever, and The Orphanage had just gone out of business, and there's a lot of bad stuff happening in the industry. But we saw an opportunity in the cloud to actually forego having to build our own data center, and much like what Todd was talking about, focus on the artists and the artistry. And so Zinc was actually just kind of Zero was just getting started up with Zinc at the time. We said, oh, cool, we'll jump in and we'll make some movies with this stuff in the cloud. And that actually worked out really well. And through the years, we tried some other solutions, and I'll talk a little bit about where we've ended up with Conductor, which is a solution that we started developing internally at Atomic Fiction a few years later. But before I go into that and talking about the cloud, I want to give some context for the kind of work that we're doing at Atomic Fiction now. So 6 years later, we are in Oakland and Montreal and Los Angeles. We have about 200 people that work across all the different studios. We're innovating on the visual effects business model, and cloud is a really, really big part of that innovation on the business model. As a result of that, we're profitable, which is a pretty big bragging right for a privately owned visual effects company these days. And we've had some incredible collaborations through our years of working with directors and producers at Atomic Fiction. These are just some of them, and I'll talk a little bit more about Star Trek Beyond and Deadpool today. But before I dive into specifics on those films, I want to give you a little bit of a peek at our demo reel for Atomic Fiction. So crank up the sound. Thanks. Obviously, we have a lot of fun at what we do, and there's nothing like sexy images to prove it. So I'm going to talk about two different projects to, again, give you a bit of context for why cloud computing is really important in the workflow. And for me, and again, this kind of goes back to being a 7-year-old watching movies, it all has to do with like the imagery that ends up on the screen and being able to entertain audiences. So Star Trek Beyond was a really challenging project for a good number of reasons. There was a huge variety of work. I think we had 600 shots in the film of different kinds of stuff. We had to design a lot of things from scratch. A lot of these environments, parts of the Enterprise that you end up in that nobody had ever seen before, that we had to do a lot of inference and kind of look at the Enterprise from the outside and work our way in to figure out what certain chambers of it should look like, stuff like that. It was a very sort of multi-location project. We had people in San Francisco, in Vancouver, in Montreal, in London, in India, in Florida working on the show, right? So it was like a lot of different places in the world that the various companies were working in. And it had a crazy schedule. The last 200 shots that we did that were supposed to be in our hands by like January didn't end up in our hands until like May, right? So the whole schedule got compressed until the very, very end. And when that happens, it's quite terrifying because if you had a fixed amount of infrastructure to get it done with, and that happened to you, you'd kind of be screwed, right? So we're constantly thanking the cloud for allowing us the flexibility in our infrastructure scale to get it done. And you know that speaks to the last point, is rendering it all, is taking these like little gray dudes and actually making them look like real things. So a few specific examples within the show, and to kind of give context for this is some making of footage from Star Trek Beyond. And they built amazing sets. You see some of them here. They built amazing costumes. They went to great lengths to do that. And they turned actors upside down and all that kind of stuff. But as you can see here, there's a limited amount that they can do. Once you're inside a giant, vast space, you can't build that for real and turn it upside down on a gimbal, right? So one of the scenes, and I'll just use a few examples here, like this was a shot where, you know, pretty cool camera move. It's supposed to be the inside of the base of the saucer in the Starship Enterprise, and this is all they built. There was no design work for what ended up beyond that set. It was just, hey, here's what we got. figure it out, right? And so we looked at the structure of the saucer of the Enterprise and did a whole bunch of artwork. And this stuff we actually, this artist, Mark Cabana, he actually does this stuff with pencil and pen, believe it or not, and then he kind of inks it in Photoshop. And so an immense amount of design work in every single little snippet, 2 or 3 seconds worth of the film. There's so much thought that goes into what's in the frame, even to the point where like stuff that you can't even see here, stuff that's under the bridge, we designed that just to make sure that everything that is in the frame is informed by the world around it, right? So the design process is really cool and time consuming. Then we go ahead and build that in 3D. And once we have this sort of like crude wireframe and we associate textures and lights and all that stuff with it, we have to render it, right? And that process of taking that and this kind of gray shaded stuff and turning into a final frame, in this instance for this particular shot, took about 500 hours for every second of the film to actually turn it into an image that looks like something, right? So a huge amount of computing time that if you did that on an artist's workstation to turn it into something that looks like this, they would literally be sitting there forever. I think Todd mentioned 9.1 million core hours of processing was done for the walk when we did that. That would have been, I think it was like 1,043 years or something if you did it on a single processor, right? So a massive, massive time scale that's all compressed down into a few months for a production, right? So yeah, hugely important to be able to offload this processing off of an artist's workstation. Here's another example. They built these suits for these dudes that ended up looking kind of weak and scrawny. So we actually had to go in and almost kind of do fake motion capture where we hand animated each of these characters to match the actual actors on set. And then we rendered them and gave them gun blasts and all that fun stuff to make them look like real kind of menacing, cool designed robots, right? Or marauders as they're called in this case. So a ton of parts of the movie that you wouldn't even think, like why would these not be guys in suits, right? Like you wouldn't even think that they were visual effects, are visual effects, right? Sometimes, we just did a period movie with Robert Zemeckis called Allied where 82% of the film has visual effects in it, and there's maybe 1 or 2 shots in the whole movie that are kind of meant to be those spectacular visual effects. Everything else is supposed to kind of be unseen, right? So there's so much unseen visual effects work in movies that are done these days, it's ridiculous. Another movie I wanted to talk to you about to give you context for why cloud rendering is really important is Deadpool. Now, in Deadpool, how many of you guys have seen Deadpool? A huge number of you. It made some money, I heard, that movie. So the whole opening freeway chase scene where Deadpool drops down into a Suburban, kicks some ass, there's all these, people get their heads cut off and cars flip and stuff like that. That whole thing was almost the whole thing was CG, right? And it was really meant to look like we went out there and filmed an action sequence on location. So what you're seeing here is the entire city that we had to design because Tim Miller, the director, he didn't want it to look like it was happening in any city that people knew. It was supposed to be kind of this fictitious city that Deadpool lived in. So we took a blend of Vancouver and a little bit of Detroit and mixed them together to create this fictitious city. Point being that every single building and every single freeway on-ramp sign and everything had to be designed and built from scratch. So that green line that you see going through the city, that's the path of the chase. And we had to make sure that everything looked awesome from any point in that green line for the film. So building the world from scratch, basically. So to start doing that, we went and took lots of photos of freeways as reference and lots more photos and lots more photos of freeways, and other things like trains, stuff like that, and exit signs, just anything that would be important. So we grounded everything in reality and had some fun doing it. This is Ryan here on the site of shooting some stuff in Detroit, I believe. And from that, we kind of mixed and matched and pulled a grab bag and started painting concept art out of the different pieces that we photographed. So what kinds of buildings do we want where? What kinds of freeway overpasses? What do the signs even want to say, right? We did concept artwork along a lot of this to make sure that the creative decisions that are done when we have to render them, which is a time-consuming process, we're not making as many mistakes in that part of the process. An artist can do this in Photoshop in a few days versus some of these renders, again, which can take hundreds of days in the aggregate to do. And then we had to build everything in painstaking 3 dimensions. So this is one of the thugs that he fights and one of the cars. And we're always, you see there's images in the upper right and upper left. We're always holding ourselves, our own feet to the fire in terms of making sure that it always looks plausible, that we're always comparing the digital stuff that we're creating to something that exists in the real world. And that even goes down to traffic, for example. Like we use AI, rather dumb AI, but we use AI nevertheless to mimic real traffic patterns, right? So we have people that spend weeks and weeks and weeks doing this kind of stuff, and then we compare them to reference of real traffic, right? To make sure it all feels believable. And all this stuff has to be rendered too. So you're starting to get the picture of the many, 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 many layers of detail that go into making a single frame of a big budget movie like Deadpool. And we have to build Deadpool himself. So the guy on the right is our CG Deadpool. The guy on the left is Ryan Reynolds in a suit. And so really, again, just trying everything we can to make things look as real as possible and always holding ourselves accountable to reality when we're doing it, which is a high bar to hit. So here's a reel of some of the work we did on Deadpool.
How about now?
We actually got some hate mail because of that demo reel breakdown, because there were a bunch of like real diehard Deadpool fans that were incredibly disappointed to learn that a bunch of that stuff wasn't real. They're like, you just ruined it for me. So we took that as a compliment. So the tools that we use to build all this stuff, there's a whole lot of them, and these are the primary ones. As Todd mentioned, Maya, you can't ever do anything in this industry without using Maya. And we use Shotgun to kind of interconnect them all. And there's one tool up here that you probably aren't familiar with, and that's Conductor. So I want to spend a little bit about talking about Conductor, because it's sort of where the rubber meets the road for us. And again, just like taking with the theme of the 7-year-old in his driveway just wanting to help make cool images, we saw an opportunity a few years ago at Atomic Fiction to build a tool that, Zinc is an amazing tool for actually going into Google Cloud Platform, and it's a great tool. We wanted to build a platform to go into the cloud that would sort of further enable just real flexibility in terms of custom plugin scripts, like all this kind of stuff, really just assuming that people would want to use the cloud in a zillion different ways. And even though that's a lot more complex, that's why Conductor and Zinc sit really well together, we wanted it to be really, really powerful as well. So to talk a little bit about why cloud is important and why we built Conductor for our studio as it grew, this is a real graph of Star Trek Beyond when we were rendering that. And the blue line is the amount of processing power that we needed at any one given time. I think that movie, we spiked at around 25,000 cores simultaneously during some of our deadline pushes. And you can actually, looking at this graph, you can see when our deadline pushes were, right? It was incredible to be able to scale our infrastructure to exactly meet the demands of the project, because the demands of the project were always changing, right? And if we'd had fixed infrastructure, that would have been terrible. And this is actually a much more recent month. This is, I think, last October when Atomic Fiction was delivering, it was a couple of different movies at once. And this is the usage graph. So the busier we get, the spikier it gets, which is actually contrary a little bit to what some of the bigger studios might have you believe, because of the fact that everybody's got this like fixed infrastructure that they've already purchased that they need to keep filled, and Atomic Fiction doesn't really have that. So the busier we get, we just make the spikes bigger. During this particular month, we spiked to over 36,000 cores simultaneously. So a huge render farm for a studio the size of Atomic Fiction. And by being able to spike up really, really big, that just makes the wall clock amount of time that it takes to do the work shorter. So you always have, like we always like to say with Conductor, if we're doing our jobs well, Conductor will spend as much time as possible doing nothing, right? Because we've scaled up so big and gotten everybody the results back so fast that then it just has a bunch of idle time in between, right? We want to get everything done right away, and that to us is the promise of cloud, which obviously doesn't really fit the traditional way of doing things. The traditional way is sort of this sawtooth method. You have a local data center, you put your artist machines online at night, that's why they kind of like go up and down. But to compare this to this, I think it's painfully obvious why cloud computing and the flexibility and the scalability of this infinite compute that Todd was referencing is really, really important. In addition to not wanting to have to build data centers, right? This is one important part of cloud. You don't actually have to ever see a physical machine ever again, which is awesome. But there's all these other parts of cloud that are really important. It's flexible, there's this massive scale, 36,000 cores sounds like a lot, but it's kind of a drop in the bucket as far as Google goes. There's a lot more room to grow as we continue to develop on Conductor. Better economics, the security is actually sort of in a little bit in a counterintuitive way actually higher within using the cloud, because companies like Google have hundreds of people in lab coats that are PhDs that focus on nothing but security all day long. So there's an opportunity for a lot more security industry-wide through the adoption of cloud. There's analytics, there's flexibility. When we started up Atomic Fiction's office in Montreal, we were up and running and rendering within a couple of weeks, where it would have taken us months to build out a data center. So it's really, really powerful in a lot of ways. And my belief is, and this is kind of why we built Conductor, is in order for your cloud solution to really live the dream of the cloud, you have to have all 6 of these things as part of the solution, right? And so that's kind of been our mission with Conductor. Compared to actually doing it every company doing it themselves, we kind of looked at this and said, well, it's taken us 2 years to get Conductor to do what it does. It's been about a $2 million investment to get it to do what it does. It's taken between 5 and 12 engineers full-time and will continue to into the future to keep it maximizing again and again and again the benefit of the cloud. And there's all these other kinds of things, constant audits on the security front. There's sort of there's a few problems with the kind of the sort of in-between way of doing it, where you're kind of using a caching mechanism between your local on-premise infrastructure and the cloud, and kind of like treating the cloud as just merely an extension of your local network. It works, and it can work really well. It just can work better, right? So we took a look at all these things and we said, wow, geez, like we've put a lot into this. Like we should turn it into a product so everybody can use it. So that's what we've done. And Conductor, it's in beta right now. We'll launch officially. We're aiming for SIGGRAPH right now. But we'd rather that every other studio doesn't have to go through this and can actually leverage the work that we've done with Conductor. So I just want to give you a little bit of a demo. And this demo is actually going to look remarkably similar to a Zinc demo because at this foundational level, they do the same thing. But I just kind of want to show you what rendering in the cloud actually looks like. This is just a quick 2-minute demo. So this is a scene from Star Trek Beyond here in Maya. And I launched the Conductor interface, which looks like any other render farm submission tool. I figure out what frames I want to submit. I can pick the machine type, and this is where things start to get a little different, is I can pick a machine type that exactly matches my needs to the specific job. I hit the Submit Job button. It uploads any files that it needs to into the cloud. If the files were already there, it doesn't need to upload them again. So we make sure that we don't transfer things again and again. And here you can see all those frames on that job. They picked up instances, and obviously this is all in fast forward, but they picked up instances that were literally, there were 36 frames on this job. It started 36 computers. They all just did the work that we wanted it to do, and now they're already finishing. And this whole process in real life takes about 4 minutes, right? Now that all these frames are actually done, they're being automatically downloaded back to my local network. And once they're automatically downloaded to my local network, then I can go and look at some images to prove that I'm not telling lies. And here's our little marauder friend coming out of this spaceship, right? So that's what cloud rendering can look like, right? That's like how simple it can be, and yet allow you to have access to thousands and thousands of machines, so that the next time those last 200 shots on Star Trek are delayed until the very last moment, or the next time that all of a sudden we have to build a whole city and do all this work to get it to all look perfect. Like Deadpool, we had a 5-month production schedule on it. Almost the entire scene, almost the entire final scene was rendered in the last 3 weeks, right? So in any other circumstance, it would have been terrifying to do that, but not because of the cloud. So we've done about 31 million core hours worth of rendering in Conductor so far. All these other stats are also true. And so we're obviously a big fan of the cloud, and whether it is tools like Zinc, tools like Conductor, what the Deadline guys are doing. I wholeheartedly feel like that 7-year-old sitting in my driveway just wanting to make cool images feels like it is so part of it's such a huge need in the industry to make the transition to cloud, because it makes everything better. It makes the creative better. It makes life better for the artist. And ultimately, for studios like Atomic Fiction, it makes it better from a business perspective. So you can check out Atomic Fiction's website there. Conductor, again, releasing as a product. So we got a couple of people here today. If you guys want to chat about it, be more than happy to. It actually uses Google Cloud Platform on the back end as well. A huge fan of theirs, and happy to answer any questions.